Hello everyone and welcome back to The Historian's Sleep. Imagine this. You're standing in the middle of a battlefield, long buried under the dust of time, where scarlet uniforms once gleamed, gunfire thundered, and epic legends still echo to this very day. In this video, we'll embark on a journey of discovery, not just dry facts of history, but vivid stories of real people, decisive moments, and hidden secrets you may have never heard before. Get ready, because what you're about to hear might just make you see history through completely new eyes. History often hides its turning points behind dates that seem unassuming at first glance. The year 1707 was one such moment. The Acts of Union, a political agreement binding England and Scotland into a single kingdom, gave birth to something far greater than just a shared parliament. It forged a new military identity, the British Army. This was not a gentle birth, but a violent induction into a Europe perpetually at war. From its very first steps, this army, clothed in crimson and armed with dog-lock muskets, was destined to bleed its way into the history books. The ink of the treaty had barely dried before the army was thrust into the War of the Spanish Succession, one of the bloodiest and most convoluted conflicts of its era. Here in fields torn apart by cannon fire and choked with powder smoke, Britain's new model of unity was put to the test. At Malplaquet in 1709, they fought with a ferocity that astonished friend and foe alike. It was a victory of sorts, but a victory steeped in misery, thousands dead, the kind of triumph where generals scribbled their names into glory, but soldiers were swallowed whole by the mud. It was this brutal baptism that hardened the red-coated ranks into something more than just men with muskets. They became a symbol, disciplined, defiant, willing to stand shoulder to shoulder, even as the ground beneath them turned into a grave. The red tunic, that splash of crimson against the smoke of battle, was not merely a uniform, it was a statement. It told the world, we are here and we will not break. Some say it was practical, red dye was cheap, and blood showed less against scarlet fabric. But to the men who wore it, it became armor of the spirit. Farmers from Yorkshire, fishermen from Cornwall, shepherds from the Highlands once clad in red, they were transformed. For centuries to come, their enemies would remember the sight of those advancing lines, a sea of scarlet pressing forward with drums pounding and bayonets fixed. Yet within this sea, there were always those who stood apart. The officer class, drawn largely from the aristocracy, did not merely wield the same muskets as their men. They carried swords, curved sabers, or elegant small swords, weapons less practical than symbolic. To carry an edged weapon into combat in an age of gunpowder was not about efficiency. It was about authority. Officers were expected to lead from the front, to mark themselves as men of higher breeding courage and command. A sword was as much a badge of rank as the fine cut of their coats. While a private in the line might carry powder and shot, his officer's sidearm glittered as an emblem of social distance. Here was a leader, and here was a man expected to die first if morale faltered. But beneath this pageantry, the gulf between classes ran deep. The enlisted man often lived on little more than salted pork and beer, his wages docked for uniforms he never owned. Outright punished harshly for even minor insubordination. Officers dined on better food, slept in tents, and purchased their commissions, a system that ensured wealth often mattered more than talent. And yet, when the cannon roared and lines collided, these distinctions blurred. In the roar of musket volleys, in the smoke so thick, it stung eyes and lungs, even a gentleman with a polished saber was just another target for a French musket ball. War, brutal and impartial, stripped away illusions of superiority. The newborn British Army also inherited a legacy from its predecessors. The disciplined traditions of Cromwell's new model army, the independent spirit of Scottish clansmen, the hardened veterans of continental campaigns. These influences fused into something unique, a military force that would soon become not just an army of Britain, but the mailed fist of an empire. Imagine standing in that line at Malplaquet. Around you are thousands of men dressed just like you, muskets leveled, bayonets gleaming faintly through the smoke. The ground shakes under the pounding of French artillery. The air is filled with the screams of the wounded and the thunder of cannon fire. You know that in moments you will be ordered forward into the storm. Yet you also know you are part of something greater, a new force, a new identity. Your red coat binds you to every man around you, to a kingdom that demands unity, and to a destiny stretching far beyond these blood-soaked fields. From these early battles, the reputation of the British soldier began to crystallize. Brave to the point of stubbornness, disciplined even in the face of slaughter, relentless in holding the line. This was not yet the global empire that would dominate the 18th and 19th centuries. This was the seed watered in blood, hardened in smoke, and clothed in scarlet. As the century wore on, that seed would grow into something immense. Marching from Europe's muddy plains to distant colonies, its redcoats both feared and hated. But here, in these first formative decades, the British Army was still shaping its character, still proving that this new kingdom's warriors could endure the crucible of modern war. And endure they did, carrying their red coats into the next chapter of conflict, one musket volley at a time. If the red coat was the body of the British soldier, then the musket was his beating heart. And in the 18th century, no weapon would define the British Army more than the Brown Bess. But before this iconic firearm became the Empire's iron companion, another symbol of elite soldiery was rising: the Grenadiers. At first, Grenadiers were not just another company of infantry. They were chosen men physically stronger, taller, and braver than their fellows selected to hurl the terrifying new weapon of war, the hand grenade. Though the grenades themselves soon fell out of favor, the image of the Grenadier endured. They were the shock troops, the tip of the spear. Their distinctive tall caps, mitre-shaped in the early days, designed so they could throw grenades without the brim of a hat getting in the way, marked them as something different, something more. On the battlefield of Warburg in 1760, fighting alongside Hanoverian allies, the Grenadiers of Britain carved their reputation in fire and blood. They charged into the French lines, their strange caps and disciplined volleys, making them a sight both inspiring and unsettling to behold. To face a Grenadier company was to stare into the embodiment of the Army's elite, a living promise that the enemy would be broken. Yet behind the imposing image of Grenadiers stood the weapon that armed not only them, but the entire line infantry, the Brown Bess musket. Introduced in the early 18th century, it was less a single model and more a family of muskets that evolved over generations. Smoothbore, .75 caliber, with a flintlock mechanism that spat fire and smoke, the Brown Bess was not a weapon of precision. It was a weapon of discipline. A single musket ball, inaccurate at long range, meant little, but 1,000 muskets fired in rolling volleys at close range became a storm of lead that shattered armies. The British Army wielded the Brown Bess for more than a century across continents, in climates from the frozen fields of Flanders to the steaming jungles of India. Soldiers joked about its quirks, cursed its heavy weight, but trusted its brutal efficiency. The musket became so synonymous with British arms that even its name, Brown Bess, carried a kind of affectionate familiarity. Some claimed Bess came from a slang term for women, others from the brownish finish of the gun. Whatever the origin to the men who carried it, the Brown Bess was both burden and companion. They slept beside it, marched with it for endless miles, and prayed it would fire when rain soaked their powder. And when it did, it spoke with thunder. It was with this musket that Britain's colonial ambitions expanded under the banner of the East India Company. This was no ordinary trading venture, but a vast private empire disguised as commerce. Chartered in 1600 by the 18th century, it controlled ports, fleets, and most importantly, armies. Tens of thousands of Indian soldiers or sepoys were enlisted into its ranks. These presidency armies, Bengal, Madras, and Bombay, became Britain's blade in South Asia. They wore a strange blend of uniforms, British red mixed with local styles, turbans paired with European muskets. The sepoys marched under British officers, drilled in British fashion, and were sent into countless campaigns from the defense of forts to expeditions deep into the subcontinent. But this arrangement was built on a brittle foundation. The sepoys were not mercenaries without loyalty. They were men with faith, culture, and tradition. Many resented the arrogance of their foreign officers, the disregard for their customs, the relentless demands of empire. And as history would prove in 1857, the muskets the British had given them could be turned back in rebellion. But even before that storm, sepoys were already shaping Britain's wars. Without them, the East India Company could not have carved its dominion across India. Every musket fired in those campaigns echoed with the tension of a divided loyalty to pay and discipline, but unease at serving foreign masters. For the grenadier in Europe or the sepoy in Bengal, the brown bess was more than iron and wood. It was a tool that defined their role in an army that was stretching itself across the globe. In the Americas, Africa, and Asia, the scarlet tunic and the heavy musket became inseparable icons feared by enemies, cursed by rebels, but always present. The sheer longevity of the brown bess speaks volumes. For over 100 years, while nations changed governments and kings fell, the same musket thundered on, carried by generation after generation of British soldiers. To understand the British Empire's rise in the 18th century, one must imagine the sound of that musket volley. Imagine standing in a line of scarlet coats shoulder to shoulder with men whose fates are bound to yours. The sergeant roars the command, the officers raise their swords, and you bite your cartridge, pour powder into the pan, ram the ball, and bring the musket to your shoulder. Beside you, 1,000 others do the same in practiced unison. Then at once, a command fire, a wall of smoke erupts, the ground shakes, and the enemy line buckles. That sound, deafening, choking, merciless, was the drumbeat of empire. And yet beyond the smoke and thunder, the soldiers themselves were often just boys. Many could not read or write, recruited from villages and cities, where hunger was more common than opportunity. The musket was heavy in their hands, their uniforms often ill-fitting, their pay meager. But once the volley was fired, once the bayonet charge came, they became something terrifying, not individuals, but a machine of empire. For those on the receiving end, the British line with its brown bess was not a collection of men, but a wall of death advancing inexorably forward. This was the paradox of the 18th century British Army, a force that relied on the discipline of common men and the authority of privileged officers bound together by the smoke of musket fire. Grenadiers with their lofty capped sepoys drilling under foreign flags and endless ranks of red-coated privates shouldering their brown bess muskets, all threads in the tapestry of an army that was no longer merely defending a small island, but was beginning to project its power to every corner of the world. The stage was set for the next great confrontation, one that would test not just the might of Britain's weapons, but the will of its empire itself. By the mid-18th century, the British Army had grown accustomed to fighting on distant fields. Its redcoats had marched through Europe, across the plains of India, and along the coasts of Africa. But in the 1770s, a rebellion erupted not on some far frontier, but in Britain's own colonies across the Atlantic, a conflict that would shake the very image of the redcoat forever. In America, the scarlet uniform was no longer just a mark of discipline and tradition. It became the most visible symbol of oppression. The colonists had another name for the red-coated soldiers who patrolled their towns and enforced British laws, bloody backs. The nickname carried venom. It mocked both the scarlet dye of the tunic and the blood that colonists believed was shed too easily under British bayonets and musket fire. To many Americans, the sight of a red coat was the sight of empire's heavy hand pressing down on their liberties. On the battlefield, another name stuck: redcoats. It was simpler, almost clinical, but it carried the same sting. To call someone a redcoat was to define him not as an individual, but as an extension of imperial will, faceless, uniform, and relentless. In taverns and newspapers and around campfires, the colonists spoke of redcoats with a mixture of fear, fury, and grim respect. For the British soldier clad in scarlet across a foreign land, there could be no hiding. His very uniform declared his allegiance from miles away. Yet not all in America saw red as the color of tyranny. There were loyalists, men and women who clung to the crown and believed rebellion to be treason. These loyalists often wore blue or green when raised into militia units, though over time they conformed to the scarlet of their regular counterparts. For them, the red coat was not oppression but order, not cruelty but civilization. They fought beside British regulars, sometimes against their own neighbors, in a conflict that tore families and towns apart. One man's tyrant was another man's protector, and the same scarlet uniform could embody both. The Grenadiers, those elite shock troops who had distinguished themselves in Europe, continued to play a prominent role in America. By this time, the grenade itself had vanished from their hands, but the grenadier remained a mark of prestige. Every infantry battalion still carried a grenadier company, and they were armed much like their line infantry brethren, though some clung to the older, longer, Longland pattern brown Bess, while others bore the newer, shorter versions. Their tall caps and disciplined bearing set them apart on the battlefield. Colonial militias often whispered of them with dread. Where grenadiers marched, a commander's resolve was plain: the enemy would be broken by Britain's finest. Yet prestige did not always translate into victory. The war in America was unlike the wars Britain had fought in Europe. The colonies were vast, the terrain unforgiving, the enemy elusive. Instead of great set-piece battles where volleys of muskets decided the day, the British often found themselves fighting skirmishes against foes who knew the land and melted away before they could be destroyed. The scarlet tunic, so visible on European battlefields, was a beacon in the forests and fields of America. Colonists mocked that the red made the British easier targets, while the rebels themselves often wore plain homespun or hunted in buckskins that blended with the trees. The psychological effect was immense. Redcoats stood out like blood against the green. And yet, despite the disadvantages, the British soldier did not lose his reputation for discipline. Eyewitnesses described their steady volleys, their ability to maintain formation under fire, their fearsome bayonet charges. For many rebels, the terror of battle came not from the musket ball, but from the moment when the British line advanced with fixed bayonets, long gleaming steel meant to drive home the Empire's resolve. Colonial fighters who had held their ground against musket fire sometimes broke at the sight of those red-coated lines charging forward, shouting in unison, officers' swords raised high. But this war was not just fought in fields. It was fought in hearts and minds. The British soldier became an ever-present figure in colonial life, quartered in houses, patrolling streets, manning outposts. To the colonists, he was both invader and neighbor, a young man perhaps not so different from themselves, yet serving a foreign king. Some American women married redcoats, others spat at them in the street. Children mocked their accents, while loyalist families prayed for their protection. For the soldiers themselves, America was a land of contradiction. They fought men who spoke the same language, read the same Bible, and shared many of the same customs. They were not facing distant others in turbans or kilts, but people who, in another world, might have been their countrymen. This blurred line between enemy and kin gave the war its bitter edge. And yet, the Grenadiers marched, the brown Bess thundered, and the scarlet tide flowed across the colonies. Battles like Bunker Hill showed that British bayonets could still break through even in the face of heavy losses. Campaigns in the South revealed the grim persistence of Britain's strategy. But for every redcoat advancing in formation, there were whispers of guerrilla fighters in the woods, ready to strike and vanish. The red uniform, once a symbol of order, became a target painted on the soldier's chest. The American Revolution carved a permanent mark into the identity of the British Army. It was here that the red coat became not only a symbol of pride, but also a symbol of fear and resentment. It was here that the word "bloody backs" was spat with venom, and where the Grenadiers' tall caps inspired awe and anger in equal measure. Though Britain would ultimately lose the colonies, the lessons learned on American soil would echo through its future campaigns. The Army had discovered the limits of sheer discipline against a new kind of war, one fought not just in volleys and bayonet charges, but in the shadows of forests, the politics of towns, and the hearts of men. And as the last Redcoats marched away from American shores, their scarlet tunics no longer represented an unstoppable empire. Instead, they carried with them the bitter taste of defeat and the knowledge that their enemies had learned much from them. The very army they had sought to crush had been shaped in part by their own discipline and example. The Redcoats legend would march on, but so too would its shadow. The American Revolution had taught Britain a bitter lesson. Muskets alone, however disciplined, were not enough to secure victory against enemies who fought from cover, who knew the forests, and who picked their targets with precision rather than waiting for a volley. Out of that realization grew the idea that Britain needed more than just line infantry and scarlet. It needed men who could think, move, and shoot differently. By the opening years of the 19th century, that transformation was embodied in a new figure on the battlefield: the rifleman. The rifle was not an entirely new weapon. Continental armies, Prussians, Austrians, and above all the Germans of the Hesse and Hanover regions had long experimented with rifled barrels. Unlike the smooth-bore Brown Bess, a rifle had grooves cut into its barrel that spun the ball as it flew, granting deadly accuracy at distances that muskets could never match. But the trade-off was time reloading. A rifle was slower, its ammunition more specialized. For decades, British generals resisted equipping their army with rifles, believing that volley fire and bayonets would always decide battles. That hesitation began to fade in the Napoleonic Wars. Facing the French in the Iberian Peninsula, Britain needed men who could strike with precision, harassing the enemy at range, targeting officers, and disrupting formations before the Scarlet Line advanced. Thus, the 95th Rifles were born. They were unlike anything the British Army had fielded before. Their uniform was not red but dark green, a color chosen not for show, but for survival. Where the scarlet tunic declared itself boldly on the battlefield, the green coat blended into grass hedges and woodland. French soldiers gave them a nickname, les insectes, the grasshoppers, for the way they darted across the terrains, small, fast, and hard to see. At first, some officers sneered. Green uniforms lacked the pomp of tradition. They seemed almost cowardly compared to the bold scarlet that had carried Britain's armies through centuries of war. But as battles unfolded, the utility of the rifleman became undeniable. With the Baker rifle, a sturdy, well-crafted weapon designed by Ezekiel Baker in London, these men could hit a target at 200 yards, even 300 under the right conditions. A musket, by contrast, was lucky to strike anything beyond 80 yards. The difference was revolutionary. Riflemen picked off French officers, artillerymen, and drummers who kept formations in step. They turned the enemy's advance into confusion before the main battle even began. Sir Arthur Wellesley, later the Duke of Wellington, quickly recognized their value. In Portugal, during the skirmishes around the village of Roliça and the clash at Vimeiro in 1808, riflemen of the 95th made their presence felt. Against a larger French force, their accuracy and mobility allowed British lines to hold and counterattack. To the ordinary redcoat, the rifleman was both a comrade and a curiosity. A soldier who marched with fewer men, often deployed in looser formation, and seemed almost free from the rigid line tactics that defined the age. Yet riflemen did not fight in isolation. They worked as the screen for the larger army, spreading ahead of the main force, skirmishing with enemy voltigeurs and chasseurs, trading shot for shot in the hedgerows and hills. Their green jackets and accuracy made them both feared and envied. To a French soldier advancing under fire, it was a chilling thought. Somewhere ahead, invisible among the trees, a rifleman might already have you in his sights. Life as a rifleman was no less harsh than that of the line infantry. The Baker rifle, though accurate, was heavy, and the ammunition supply was never as plentiful as for the Brown Bess. Cleaning the rifled barrel was essential, lest powder residue ruin the weapon's accuracy. And in the confusion of large battles like Talavera or Salamanca, riflemen risked being cut off, isolated from their comrades in scarlet. The very looseness of their formation made them vulnerable if the enemy pressed too hard. Many riflemen fell not in grand volleys, but in lonely exchanges of fire unseen in the smoke. Still, their reputation grew. The 95th Rifles became legendary not just for their performance in battle, but for the image they created. Green jackets, black leather cross belts, and the long Baker rifle slung across their shoulders, they looked nothing like the traditional redcoat, and for that very reason they captured imaginations. Even decades later, when novels and memoirs of the Napoleonic Wars were written, the rifleman was often the romantic hero, independent, deadly, and a little outside the rigid hierarchy of the army. The psychological shift mattered as much as the tactical one. The British Army, once wedded to the line, was beginning to recognize the importance of adaptability. The rifleman was a symbol of this new flexibility, a soldier who could combine discipline with initiative, tradition with innovation. And though they were few in number compared to the vast ranks of scarlet-clad infantry, their impact on Britain's campaigns in Spain and Portugal was profound. But perhaps the greatest testament to their worth came at Waterloo in 1815. There, amid the thunder of cannon and the desperate charges of Napoleon's army, riflemen of the 95th held their ground in the hedgerows and farmhouses, sniping at advancing French columns, buying precious time for Wellington's lines to hold. The grasshoppers, as the French still called them, were no longer just an oddity. They were the quiet killers of empire, invisible until their rifles cracked and another French officer fell. For the British soldier, the red coat would remain the most iconic image for centuries to come. But alongside it now stood the green jacket of the rifleman, a reminder that war was evolving, that visibility was no longer glory but death, and that sometimes survival meant blending into the land itself. The Baker rifle carried across Europe's fields and hills symbolized not just accuracy, but a new way of thinking about battle. And the men who bore it, the grasshoppers of Britain, had forever changed the rhythm of war. By the second decade of the 19th century, the red coat and the brown bess had marched across half the globe. But in 1812, the empire turned its attention back to the Americas, this time against a familiar adversary, the young United States. Britain was still locked in a titanic struggle with Napoleon, but across the Atlantic, simmering tensions with America erupted into war. The War of 1812 is often remembered in fragments: privateers, dueling on the seas, frontier skirmishes, the Star-Spangled Banner flying over Fort McHenry. Yet for the British Army, one event blazed into memory above all: the March on Washington. In 1814, after defeating American forces at Bladensburg, British troops advanced into the heart of the American capital. They carried the same brown bess muskets their fathers had wielded decades earlier during the Revolution, now in the India pattern variations, slightly shorter, somewhat refined, but still instantly recognizable to any soldier of the crown. With these muskets slung over their shoulders, the British entered Washington and set fire to its public buildings. Flames consumed the Capitol and the President's house, the blaze so fierce that the night sky glowed red. For Americans, it was humiliation. For the British, it was proof that their scarlet ranks could still strike fear into their former colonies. Yet despite the symbolic victory, the war remained inconclusive. Neither side gained decisive ground. In the end, Britain withdrew not out of defeat, but out of necessity. Europe demanded attention. Napoleon had returned from exile, and Europe was once again a battlefield. The final reckoning loomed: Waterloo, June 1815. The fields of Belgium were soaked in rain, the mud clinging to boots and wheels, turning the ground into a mire. On that sodden plain, the fate of Europe would be decided. Facing Napoleon's army, the veterans of countless campaigns stood the coalition led by the Duke of Wellington. Among them were the men of the Black Watch, the 42nd Regiment of Foot, one of Scotland's proudest Highland regiments. The Black Watch marched into Waterloo not in the plain khaki of later wars, but in full Highland dress, dark jackets, cross belts, and most striking of all, the patterned kilts of their regimental tartan. To modernize, the idea of wearing a kilt into battle seems ceremonial, almost theatrical. But to these men, the kilt was more than clothing. It was heritage woven into cloth. The swirling patterns of dark green and blue, streaked with red, proclaimed their identity as Highlanders. Each regiment had its own tartan, and each tartan tied the soldier not just to his unit, but to centuries of clan tradition. In the smoke and thunder of Waterloo, these kilts stood out like banners of defiance. Cannonballs plowed through ranks, musket volleys tore holes in formations, cavalry charges thundered against squares bristling with bayonets. Yet the Highlanders held. Witnesses spoke of the eerie sightlines of men in tartan kilts advancing into battle with pipes playing faces, grim muskets firing in disciplined volleys. The French called them Les Diables Noirs, the Black Devils, for their dark dress, fierce resolve, and relentless courage. The Brown Bess was still the weapon of choice, though its limitations were increasingly evident. Smoke from thousands of muskets clouded the field until friend and foe alike vanished in a choking haze. At close range, volleys tore through ranks like scythes through wheat, but beyond 100 yards, accuracy was guesswork. Officers shouted over the din, swords raised, urging their men to hold the line. For many, the bayonet charge remained the true moment of decision, cold steel driving into the chaos, pushing back the French advance. Napoleon's Imperial Guard veterans with an aura of invincibility made their final assault late in the day. They advanced steadily, drums beating eagles aloft. For a moment, it seemed the British line might break, but it was here that the discipline forged over a century proved decisive. The British infantry, scarlet and tartan alike, held their fire until the last moment. Then at Wellington's command, they unleashed a devastating volley. The Guard staggered, wavered, and for the first time in its history retreated. A cheer erupted across the Allied line. The spell of Napoleonic invincibility was broken. Waterloo was a slaughterhouse. More than 40,000 men fell in a single day. The mud ran with blood, and corpses lay in heaps where volleys had torn through entire battalions. Yet it was also the end of an era. Napoleon was defeated, his empire shattered, and Britain emerged as the world's foremost power. The Redcoat and the Brown Bess had carried the day one last time in the Great Continental Wars. For the Highlanders, Waterloo cemented their legend. The image of kilted soldiers standing firm against the might of France became part of British military mythology. To wear a tartan in battle was to embody a fierce blend of national pride and martial valor. Even today, Highland regiments maintain their distinctive patterns, each kilt a reminder of a time when Scotland's sons fought and bled for the Empire in Europe's decisive clash. And yet for the ordinary soldier, there was little romance in the aftermath. Survivors trudged home, scarred, exhausted, their muskets battered, their uniforms torn. Many would never forget the screams, the smoke, the terror of cavalry bearing down on their squares. The Brown Bess, once the Empire's pride, was showing its age in a world where rifled barrels and new technologies were emerging. But at Waterloo, in the mud and fire of Napoleon's last gamble, it had done its duty. Thus ended the age of scarlet lines and musket volleys as Europe had known them. The Redcoat was still iconic, the kilt still proud, the Brown Bess still reliable. But the world of war was beginning to change, and the British Army would soon face new challenges that would demand not just tradition, but transformation. By the 1850s, the British Army was no longer the scarlet tide that had faced Napoleon. It was an institution stretched thin across empire, hardened by colonial wars, but still reliant on the old weapon that had served for over a century, the Brown Bess. Yet history does not wait for traditions. New technologies were emerging, and a new conflict would force the British Army to abandon the past and embrace the rifle age. That conflict was the Crimean War, fought against the Russian Empire alongside French and Ottoman allies. It was a war born of politics, but remembered for its misery. The names Inkerman, Sevastopol, and Balaclava became etched into Britain's collective memory, not for glorious victories alone, but for the staggering toll of cold hunger and mismanagement. At Inkerman in 1854, British troops alongside their French allies faced waves of Russian infantry in chaotic close-quarters fighting. It was not the neat battle lines of Waterloo. This was confusion in fog and smoke bayonets, clashing in brutal hand-to-hand combat muskets fired at near point-blank range. Here, the British soldier began to see the limits of the old smoothbore weapons. Against an enemy willing to press hard volleys at close range were devastating, but when distance mattered, the Brown Bess faltered. The solution had already begun to appear: the rifle musket. First came the pattern 1851 Minié rifle, then the more famous pattern 1853 Enfield rifle musket. Unlike the smoothbore Brown Bess, the rifled barrel of the Enfield spun its bullet with deadly accuracy. Suddenly, soldiers could strike at ranges that seemed impossible a generation before. This leap in firepower marked the beginning of modern infantry combat, but the transition was uneven. At the start of the war, as many as 1/5 of British infantry were still armed with older percussion-cap smoothbores, particularly the pattern 1842 musket. Soldiers marched into Crimea carrying weapons that already felt obsolete. By 1855, however, the entire army of the East had been re-equipped with the rifle musket. For the first time, the British soldiers' firepower matched the terrain and the enemy. From this point onward, rifles would define the battlefield. Yet weapons were only one part of the story. The Crimean War revealed the human cost of mismanagement. The soldiers who fought there endured conditions more deadly than Russian bayonets. Winter came early and supply lines failed. Men shivered in thin greatcoats as snow blanketed their camps. Rations, spoiled boots fell apart, and disease spread like wildfire. Cholera, dysentery, and frostbite killed more men than the Russians ever could. It was here that another figure entered the mythology of Britain's wars: Florence Nightingale. Known as the Lady with the Lamp, she walked the wards of field hospitals at night, bringing order and compassion to a medical system overwhelmed by suffering. Her reforms in hygiene, nursing, and logistics would outlast the war itself, reshaping military medicine for generations. Soldiers wrote home of her presence as if she were a saint amid the horrors of the Crimea. For many, she embodied a new idea that the soldier's life mattered, that care and discipline off the battlefield could save as many as courage on it. But on the battlefield itself, the rifle was proving its worth. At Sevastopol, entrenched warfare foreshadowed what the world would later see in the First World War. Soldiers dug and exchanged long-range fire and endured months of siege. The days of advancing in bright lines, muskets roaring in unison, were fading. War was becoming industrial, grinding, and impersonal. A single rifleman could reach across hundreds of yards to kill a man he could barely see. The psychological weight of that shift was immense. For centuries, battle had been personal volleys at close-range charges where you could see the whites of your enemy's eyes. Now, death could arrive silently from afar, from a faceless figure hidden in the smoke. The Battle of Balaclava revealed another side of this new age of war. It is remembered today for the charge of the Light Brigade, a tragic cavalry assault immortalized by Tennyson's poem. British horsemen misunderstood orders in hand, charged headlong into Russian guns. The rifles of the infantry were powerful, but the outdated romance of cavalry charges still lingered. The clash of old and new was everywhere: sabers against shells, gallantry against gunpowder. For the ordinary soldier, the Crimean War was less about poetry and more about survival. Letters home spoke of mud so deep it swallowed boots of lice that never left of nights spent freezing under torn blankets. Officers wrote of bravery, but privates wrote of hunger. Yet through it all, the rifle changed the soldier's experience. With the Enfield, a private could finally feel that his weapon gave him a fighting chance, not just in mass volleys, but in individual combat. Accuracy, once a privilege of specialist units, like the rifleman of the 95th, was now the standard. Every man was expected to hit his mark. Every man carried in his hands the future of warfare. The Crimean War ended in 1856, with Britain and its allies victorious, but the cost was staggering. Nearly 500,000 men from all sides perished, most from disease and exposure. The war had exposed the flaws of an army unprepared for modern conflict, but had also pushed it into a new era. No longer could Britain rely solely on tradition and bravery. Technology, logistics, and care for soldiers were now as crucial as courage. The Redcoats still marched, but now it marched with a weapon that truly belonged to the industrial age. The rifle musket had supplanted the musket, and with it came a new rhythm of battle, longer ranges, deadlier exchanges, and the beginning of trench warfare. The British Army had entered the rifle age, and there would be no turning back. For the men who survived Crimea, the memory of frozen camps, endless sieges, and the crack of rifles never faded. They had fought not just an enemy, but the very elements, and in doing so, they had ushered Britain's soldiers into the modern world of war. When the thunder of Crimea faded, the British Army did not rest. Its soldiers marched eastward toward Asia, where the Empire's hunger for trade and power would spark new wars. Here, scarlet coats and rifle muskets would meet civilizations older than Britain itself, and the consequences would echo for centuries. The Opium Wars against China were not conflicts of survival, but of commerce. Brutal proof that Britain's empire was as much about profit as about power. British merchants had grown wealthy selling opium to China, feeding an epidemic that hollowed out families and corrupted officials. When the Qing dynasty tried to end the trade, Britain responded not with diplomacy, but with gunpowder. In 1841, the city of Canton, home to nearly 1 million people, fell to a force of barely 6,000 British soldiers and sailors backed by modern weapons. The Scarlet Ranks marched through a city older and larger than London, the Union Jack raised over foreign walls, and for the Empire it seemed a triumph of efficiency. But beneath that triumph lay tragedy, a society destabilized, lives destroyed by addiction, and a war fought not for freedom, but for narcotics. To the British soldier, though, such grand moral questions were distant. He knew only the rifle in his hands, the orders of his officers, and the strange alien streets in which he fought. At this time, the British Army's standard weapon was the pattern 1953 Enfield rifle musket, a weapon already proving itself in Crimea. In China's cities, its long reach and accuracy gave the British a decisive advantage over defenders still armed with older firearms and traditional weapons. To the soldier firing from behind sandbags or storming gates, the Enfield was a reassurance, a tool that made 6,000 men feel like 60,000. But the Empire's greatest test would not come in China. It would come in India, at the very heart of Britain's eastern dominion. The East India Company had ruled vast territories of the subcontinent for a century, but its power was built on fragile foundations. Sepoy soldiers, Indians enlisted into company armies, made up the majority of its strength. They drilled in British fashion, wore hybrid uniforms, and carried British weapons. But beneath the discipline, resentment grew. Resentment at low-pay disrespect from foreign officers and disregard for religious and cultural traditions. That resentment erupted in 1857. The spark was small rumors that the cartridges for the new Enfield rifles were greased with animal fat cow for Hindus, pig for Muslims. To load the rifle, sepoys had to bite the cartridge open. For many, it was not just disrespect, it was sacrilege. The cartridge controversy ignited a firestorm of rebellion. Sepoys turned their weapons on their officers, cities rose in revolt, and the rebellion spread like wildfire across northern India. For Britain, the shock was immense. The very soldiers on whom they relied had become their enemies, and the red coat now faced the mirror image of itself, sepoys armed with the same rifles, trained in the same drills, but now driven by fury. The fighting was savage. Mutineers slaughtered British officers and their families. The British retaliated with equal ferocity. Cities like Delhi and Lucknow became battlegrounds where entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. For the British Army, the rebellion was both a nightmare and a revelation. The old assumptions that discipline and superior weapons would always guarantee obedience collapsed overnight. The Empire realized that ruling through sepoys meant nothing without respect, and respect had been in short supply. When the rebellion was finally crushed in 1858, the East India Company was abolished. Its armies became part of the Crown, and India was ruled directly by the British government. The rebellion left scars deeper than battlefields. For British soldiers, it became a tale of betrayal and vengeance retold in regimental messes for decades. For Indians, it was remembered as the First War of Independence, a heroic, if doomed, stand against foreign rule. For both, it was proof that empire was not a simple march of progress, but a fragile balance of power and resentment. Out of the flames of India came another change, less dramatic but equally lasting: the evolution of the soldier's uniform. For centuries, the British Army had worn bright scarlet coats trimmed with blue or gold uniforms that looked splendid on parade but made men glaring targets in battle. In India's sun-scorched plains under fire from rebels who knew the terrain, those uniforms became a liability. Practicality replaced pomp. Soldiers began to adopt drab, dust-colored clothing. By the late 1850s, khaki, from the Persian word for dust, became the new standard for field service. At first, khaki seemed almost shameful. Many officers lamented the loss of scarlet, the color that had carried Britain to glory from Malplaquet to Waterloo. But war had changed. Concealment mattered more than splendor, survival more than tradition. The Indian Rebellion drove the point home with brutal clarity. Soldiers in bright red made easy marks for sepoy sharpshooters, while khaki blended with the land. The shift from scarlet to khaki symbolized more than just camouflage. It marked the Army's slow transformation from a force of spectacle into a modern professional machine. For centuries, uniforms had proclaimed identity and pride. Now they bent to necessity. The Empire was learning sometimes too late that survival required adaptation. The rifle musket, the sepoy's revolt, the dust-colored khaki, these were not just changes in weaponry or fabric. They were signs that Britain's wars were no longer the pageantry of marching lines, but the brutal grind of empire against resistance, technology against tradition, and pride against practicality. The soldier who once stood tall in scarlet now crouched in khaki, his rifle aimed across walls and jungles, fighting not just for Britain's honor, but for his own survival. Asia had shown the British Army both its strength and its fragility. Victories in China proved how powerful modern weapons could make even a small force. The rebellion in India proved how dangerous arrogance could be when ruling a foreign land. And together they left the British soldier standing on the edge of a new world, one where every battle would test not just his courage, but his ability to adapt. By the late 19th century, the British Empire had wrapped its red and blue banners around vast stretches of the world. Yet in southern Africa, it would face one of its greatest humiliations and one of its most celebrated last stands against an enemy armed not with rifles and artillery, but with courage, cunning, and the deadly assegai spear. The Anglo-Zulu War of 1879 began with British arrogance. Confident in their weapons, uniforms, and discipline, British commanders dismissed the Zulu kingdom as a tribal power that could be brushed aside with a show of force. The reality was very different. The Zulu army was a disciplined, organized fighting machine honed through years of rigorous training under Shaka and his successors. They fought not as scattered warriors, but as regiments, each with their own colors, songs, and traditions. And though they carried shields of cowhide and stabbing spears rather than rifles, they possessed something even more dangerous: speed, unity, and an iron will to defend their land. On 22nd of January 1879, at the foot of the rocky mountain of Isandlwana, the pride of Britain's expeditionary force learned this lesson in blood. A British column of more than 1,700 men camped without proper defenses, believing themselves secure. But the Zulu army, over 20,000 strong, moved with stealth and ferocity. Emerging like a storm, they encircled the camp with their famous horns of the buffalo formation, enveloping the British from three sides. The red and blue coats of the 24th Regiment of Foot stood firm at first, Martini Henry rifles cracking in disciplined volleys. The Martini Henry was the most modern rifle the British had yet fielded. Breech-loading, powerful, capable of sending its .45 caliber bullet accurately across hundreds of yards. Against earlier enemies, it had been devastating. But at Isandlwana, firepower alone could not hold back the tide. The Zulus closed the distance with terrifying speed, their shields absorbing bullets, their ranks never faltering. Once the assegais pierced the British line, chaos reigned. Ammunition ran low. Units were isolated and discipline collapsed. By the end of the day, Isandlwana was a massacre. Over 1,300 British and colonial troops lay dead, one of the worst defeats ever suffered by Britain at the hands of a non-European army. The news sent shockwaves across the empire. How could Britain, mistress of the seas, conqueror of Napoleon, fall to warriors without rifles or cannon? For the Zulu, it was a moment of triumph, proof that courage and tactics could humble even the greatest empire. But the same day that saw Britain's humiliation also saw one of its most celebrated defenses. At a small mission station called Rorke's Drift, barely 140 British soldiers found themselves facing a Zulu force of 4,000. Led by Lieutenants John Chard and Gonville Bromhead, the defenders hastily built barricades of mealie bags and biscuit boxes. Through the afternoon, into the night, and into the next morning, wave after wave of Zulu warriors hurled themselves against the tiny garrison. The crack of Martini Henry rifles never ceased. Flames lit the night as the hospital was set alight and hand-to-hand fighting raged over the barricades. When the smoke cleared, the mission still stood. 17 British soldiers were dead, but hundreds of Zulu bodies lay around the outpost. 11 Victoria Crosses were awarded for the defense of Rorke's Drift, more than for any single action in British history. It was hailed in newspapers as proof that British courage and discipline could still prevail, even against overwhelming odds. Yet behind the heroism lay harsher truths. The very same red uniforms that had once symbolized imperial power were becoming a liability. In the African sun, scarlet and blue made soldiers easy targets. Worse, they clashed with the new reality of warfare, fast-moving enemies who struck from concealment. Practicality once again demanded change, and khaki uniforms already tested in India began to replace the bright colors of old. Still, in 1879, most British soldiers in Africa marched to battle in scarlet tunics and white sun helmets. The contrast was striking bright European uniforms against the raw earth and tall grass of Zululand. To the Zulu, the sight must have seemed almost unreal, men in red standing shoulder to shoulder, rifles gleaming in the sun. To the British, the Zulu army was equally unsettling, ranks of warriors chanting, stamping, and singing as they advanced with shields raised. The lessons of the war were harsh, but vital. Isandlwana proved that discipline and firepower could be overwhelmed if arrogance blinded commanders to the strength of their enemies. Rorke's Drift proved that courage and preparation could hold against impossible odds. Together, the two battles reshaped the Army's approach to colonial warfare. But perhaps more lasting than tactics was the memory. In 1964, the film Zulu immortalized Rorke's Drift, turning it into one of the most famous last stands in cinema. The image of British soldiers in scarlet coats firing volley after volley as Zulu warriors hurled themselves forward became etched into popular culture. Yet for the descendants of the Zulu, Isandlwana remained a point of pride, the day when warriors armed with shields and spears humbled the might of empire. For the soldiers who fought in those battles, the Martini Henry rifle became both savior and burden. Its recoil was brutal, bruising shoulders and tearing at flesh, but its power was undeniable. Soldiers spoke of its crack like thunder and the way its bullets tore through shields. Yet many also remembered how at Isandlwana, even the best rifle in the world could not save them when ammunition wagons stalled and the enemy pressed too close. The Anglo-Zulu War stood as a reminder that empire was never secure, never easy. The redcoat could inspire fear, but it could also attract death. The rifle could kill at range, but it could not guarantee victory. In Africa's hills and grasslands, Britain learned humility. And in those battles, amid the smoke of Martini Henrys and the chants of Zulu regiments, the old world of scarlet and spectacle collided with a new age of practicality and adaptation. The closing years of the 19th century brought the British Army into a new kind of war, one that looked nothing like the grand set-piece battles of Europe, nor the colonial clashes of Africa or India. In South Africa, against the Boer republics of the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, the empire's soldiers encountered an enemy who did not march in neat lines or wear bright colors, but who fought from concealment with patience, precision, and deadly modern rifles. At first, confidence ran high. Britain was the most powerful empire on earth, its navy unmatched, its soldiers hardened by campaigns across continents. The Boers, by contrast, were farmers of Dutch descent, tough men, yes, but few in number. Surely they could not stand against the might of the Redcoat, yet the reality proved otherwise. By 1899, the British Army had already shifted away from scarlet in the field. Khaki had become standard in foreign service, a dull dust-colored fabric that blended with the landscape. In South Africa, this was essential. The open veld with its dry grasses and endless horizons turned scarlet into a death sentence. Against Boer sharpshooters armed with the Mauser rifle, camouflage was the only protection. The khaki uniform was no longer a reluctant concession to climate. It was survival. The Mauser rifle was itself a revelation. Sleek, accurate, and firing with smokeless powder, it outclassed many of the weapons carried by Britain's soldiers. Where the Martini Henry had bellowed with thick clouds of smoke, betraying a rifleman's position, after each shot, the Mauser spoke with a sharp crack and left almost no trace. The Boers' skilled hunters raised in the saddle and behind the rifle used it with devastating effect. They fought not in massed formations, but in loose groups, sniping from ridges and kopjes, disappearing before the British could bring their volleys to bear. The result was catastrophe. In December 1899, remembered bitterly as Black Week, the British suffered a string of humiliating defeats at Stormberg, Magersfontein, and Colenso. At Magersfontein, Highland regiments marched forward in tight formation, as they had done for generations, only to be cut down by Boer rifle fire from hidden trenches. Soldiers fell in rows, their discipline and bravery wasted against an enemy they could barely see. Then came Bloody Sunday, another disaster where poor planning and underestimation of the enemy led to staggering losses. The myth of British invincibility cracked. Newspapers at home raged, families grieved, and commanders were forced to admit that the old ways no longer worked. The British soldiers, still armed with variations of the Lee Metford and Lee Enfield rifles, had the tools to match the Boers, but not yet the training. The Lee rifle was a marvel, a bolt-action weapon with a magazine that allowed rapid, repeated fire. In skilled hands, it could unleash a storm of bullets far faster than older single-shot rifles. Yet too often, British tactics lagged behind technology. Officers still clung to outdated doctrines, demanding advances in lines or bayonet charges across open ground. Against the Boers' hidden marksmen, this was suicide. Slowly, painfully, the army adapted. Soldiers began to fight in extended order, spreading out rather than clustering together. They learned to take cover, to crawl, to use the terrain. They developed new systems of supply and transport, building blockhouses and railway defenses to choke the Boers' mobility. Cavalry units became scouts and raiders rather than parade ground showpieces. The lessons were harsh, bought with blood, but they transformed the army from a force rooted in tradition to one moving toward modernity. The Boer War also tested the morale of the common soldier. The endless marches across the veld, the scorching sun by day and freezing cold by night, the constant threat of ambush, these wore men down. Letters home spoke of exhaustion, frustration, and a grim respect for the enemy. The Boers were not savages, but fellow Europeans, stubborn and skilled, defending their homeland with ferocity. It was a war of equals in some ways, and that made it all the more bitter. For Britain, victory eventually came not through brilliance, but through grinding endurance. The construction of thousands of blockhouses, the use of scorched earth tactics, and the establishment of concentration camps for Boer civilians broke the back of the resistance. By 1902, the Republic surrendered. The British flag flew over all of South Africa, but the cost was high. Over 20,000 British soldiers had died, many from disease. Boer civilian casualties, especially in the camps, were even higher. And though Britain claimed victory, the war revealed uncomfortable truths. The Empire's military machine, once thought unstoppable, had been nearly undone by a small nation of farmers armed with modern rifles and modern tactics. For the British Army itself, the lessons were enduring. No longer could commanders ignore fieldcraft marksmanship and logistics. No longer could bright uniforms or rigid formations be trusted. The soldier of the new century had to adapt, to think, to fight as an individual as well as part of a unit. The Lee Enfield rifle, destined to serve for decades to come, became the symbol of that adaptability. With its rapid bolt action and magazine capacity, it turned every soldier into a potential storm of fire, provided he was trained to use it well. Perhaps most of all, the Boer War solidified the end of an era. Scarlet was gone, confined now to parades and ceremonies. Khaki was the future. The British soldier, once a figure of pageantry, had become a figure of practicality. The world of empire was shifting, and the wars of the 20th century loomed on the horizon. As veterans returned from South Africa, many bore scars not only on their bodies, but on their minds. They had seen the old ways fail, and they had felt the sting of underestimating their enemy. Around campfires and in barrack, stories of Black Week and Bloody Sunday were told with grim clarity, cautionary tales for the next generation of soldiers. The Boer War was not the grand, glorious triumph of Waterloo, nor the humiliating disaster of Isandlwana. It was something more complex, a teacher, a crucible. It forced the British Army to shed the last vestiges of its past and take its first uneasy steps into the modern age. And as the 20th century dawned, the lessons of South Africa would soon be tested on a scale greater than anyone could have imagined. By 1940s, the world had changed, and the British soldier no longer marched into battle in scarlet. Gone were the bright facings and gleaming buttons of the 19th century. The Boer Wars had already taught the Empire that camouflage was survival, and now every British soldier wore khaki service dress, dull practical, and uniform across all ranks. For the first time in centuries, the British Army looked less like a parade ground and more like a machine built for war. When war broke out in August, young men flocked to recruiting stations by the hundreds of thousands. Posters promised adventure glory and the defense of civilization itself. Farmers, clerks, students, miners, all were handed the same khaki tunic and trousers, the same puttees wound tightly around their legs, and the same weapon, the short magazine Lee Enfield Mk3. The SMLE, as it was known, was a masterpiece of design. With its 10-round magazine and smooth bolt action, it allowed trained riflemen to fire aimed shots with astonishing speed. British soldiers drilled until they could unleash what the Germans called the Mad Minute, 15 or more accurate rounds in 60 seconds faster than some machine guns. It was this rifle, not the machine gun, that defined the opening battles of the war for the British. At Mons and Ypres, German soldiers advancing in massed formations were cut down by rapid fire they mistook for machine guns. The SMLE became not just a weapon, but a legend carried by millions of men across the mud of France, the sands of the Middle East, and the rocky cliffs of Gallipoli. Officers, too, saw their world transformed. The elegant swords that had once symbolized rank were still carried, but now more often as relics of tradition than tools of war. A revolver, usually the Webley MX6, became the officer's true sidearm. Heavy, reliable, and powerful, it was the weapon of choice in the trenches, where a pistol was often more useful than a sword when fighting in confined dugouts or leading charges over the top. Still, many officers clung to the rituals of the past, carrying canes or wearing Sam Browne belts, even as modern war swept away such affectations. The greatest change, however, came not from rifles or revolvers, but from the battlefield itself. The Western Front was unlike anything the British Army had ever endured. Instead of open plains and sweeping charges, there were trenches, endless lines of mud and wire stretching from the Channel to Switzerland. Soldiers lived, fought, and died in ditches carved into the earth, surrounded by the stench of decay, the constant threat of artillery, and the omnipresent mud that sucked at boots and swallowed wagons whole. In those trenches, the khaki uniform was less a matter of pride than of endurance. It became caked in filth, infested with lice, stiff with dried mud. Helmets once absent from British service were introduced as casualties from head wounds soared. The Brodie helmet, a simple steel bowl with a wide brim, became as iconic to World War I as the scarlet tunic had been a century earlier. Soldiers gave it nicknames: Tin Hat, Battle Bowler. Crude though it looked, it saved countless lives from shrapnel and debris. The Redcoat had once been a symbol of fear. The Brodie helmet became a symbol of survival. Rows of men crouched in muddy trenches, steel helmets glinting faintly in the dim light, rifles ready, waiting for the whistle that meant it was time to go over the top. That was the new image of the British Army. Not bright ranks marching in unison, but haggard faces under steel bracing themselves for slaughter. Life in the trenches was a nightmare, beyond anything the Victorian soldier had known. Rats grew fat on corpses, artillery pounded night and day, and poison gas drifted across the battlefield, burning lungs and blinding eyes. The khaki-clad soldier who had once marched proudly into recruiting stations now crouched knee-deep in muck praying for survival. And yet, discipline held. Letters home spoke not just of misery, but of camaraderie, of tea brewed in mess tins, of songs sung to drown out the guns, of friendships forged in the shadow of death. The British officer corps too transformed. In earlier wars, officers had stood out with brighter uniforms, swords at their sides, and private purchase tunics of finer cut. In 1914, there were still differences in quality and detail, but in the trenches, mud and blood erased those distinctions. An officer's revolver might be polished, but his uniform was just as filthy as his men's. In that equality of hardship, some of the old barriers between rank and file softened, though not enough to erase the gulf of class that still lingered in promotions and privileges. By 1916, the war had consumed millions of lives, and the British Army had become a vast industrialized machine, khaki-clad soldiers, rifles in hand, steel helmets on their heads, advanced through shell-torn landscapes where nothing grew but barbed wire. Battles like the Somme and Passchendaele were not victories of maneuver, but tests of endurance. The Redcoat had once proclaimed, "We are here, we will not break." Now, khaki proclaimed, "We endure no matter the cost." The psychological weight was immense. To fight in such conditions day after day, year after year, required a discipline different from that of Malplaquet or Waterloo. It was not the discipline of parade ground volleys, but of survival to stand firm when shells buried comrades alive, when gas turned lungs to fire, when weeks passed without rest. The British soldier endured, and in enduring, he helped break the stalemate. By war's end in 1918, the army that marched back to Britain was unrecognizable from the scarlet-clad lines of the 18th century. It was larger, harder, more mechanized. Tanks had rolled across the front, aircraft had dueled in the skies, and machine guns had scythed down waves of infantry. But amid all the change, one constant remained: the discipline of the British soldier, his willingness to hold the line no matter the cost. The red coat was gone. The khaki service dress, the SMLE rifle, the Brodie helmet, these were the new symbols. And though the war had drained Britain of blood and treasure, it had also cemented the identity of the modern British Army: practical, adaptable, forged in the mud of trenches rather than the pomp of parades. World War I was not the glorious pageantry of empire. It was the grim endurance of millions in khaki standing shoulder to shoulder in the mud, proving that even in the darkest storms, the line would hold. When the guns of August 1914 had fallen silent, Britain swore it had endured the war to end all wars. Yet scarcely 2 decades later, the empire found itself once again staring down an enemy in Europe. This time, it was Nazi Germany armed with tanks, aircraft, and a new style of warfare that swept aside the old defenses like paper. In 1940, the British Expeditionary Force in France was shattered by Hitler's blitzkrieg. German panzers and Stukas drove relentlessly across the Low Countries, forcing Britain's army into a desperate retreat toward the Channel. At Dunkirk, hundreds of thousands of men crowded the beaches waiting for rescue as German shells rained down. They wore the standard wool battle dress of the era, a practical khaki-colored uniform with its distinct short-waisted blouse, designed for utility rather than parade ground show. The Mark III Lee Enfield rifle, unchanged in essence from its Great War ancestor, was still in their hands, reliable as ever. The evacuation was a miracle. Soldiers clambered onto destroyers, fishing boats, even pleasure craft pressed into service. Dunkirk was no victory, but survival itself felt like triumph. And for the men who made it home, the memory of standing in wool uniforms on that shell-pocked beach, rifles at the ready, would never fade. Back in Britain, the threat of invasion loomed. Churchill, never one to bow to despair, demanded the creation of special units capable of striking back at the enemy even as the island prepared its defenses. "Set Europe ablaze," he ordered. The result was the birth of the Commandos. Volunteers trained in brutal conditions expected to raid enemy coasts, sabotage positions, and sow fear behind German lines. Their uniforms remained simple wool battle dress webbing gear, steel helmets, but in their spirit they were heirs to the grenadiers of old chosen men entrusted with dangerous tasks. One of the most audacious creations of this era was the Special Air Service, or SAS. Its architect, David Stirling, believed that small teams of highly trained soldiers could inflict damage far beyond their numbers. While the name suggested airborne operations, Stirling's SAS began not with parachutes, but with jeeps in the desert. North Africa became their testing ground, a land of endless heat and open horizons where mobility was survival. Clad in tropical uniforms adapted for the desert, SAS raiders struck deep behind enemy lines, destroying fuel depots, airfields, and over 60 aircraft in a single raid. Their insignia parachute wings worn above the pocket became a badge of pride, treated with the same reverence as medals. The SAS embodied a new kind of British soldier, resourceful, daring, and unorthodox. They operated in secrecy, using guile as much as firepower. Where once the British Army had relied on sheer mass of men in scarlet or khaki, now it turned to stealth surprise and small unit tactics. Stirling himself described his men as hunters slipping through the desert like shadows, their jeeps bristling with machine guns, their uniforms covered in sand and sweat. Alongside them, another corps continued a tradition stretching back to the 15th century, the Royal Engineers. Known as sappers, these men provided the backbone of military engineering, building defenses, blowing bridges, and clearing minefields. In the deserts of North Africa, where open terrain made fortifications vital, sappers played a crucial role. They laid minefields to halt Rommel's Africa course, and when called upon, crawled out under fire to remove those same mines to clear a path for advancing tanks. Their skill and bravery made them indispensable, even if their work was often unsung compared to the glamour of the commandos or SAS. Meanwhile, the wider British Army adapted to the global war. The Thompson submachine gun, imported from America, found its way into the hands of commandos and paratroopers, offering devastating close-range firepower. Ordinary riflemen still clutched their Lee Enfields, a weapon that by now had earned a reputation as one of the finest bolt-action rifles in the world. The simplicity of the steel helmet, the rugged practicality of battle dress, and the reliability of British arms carried the soldier from the sands of North Africa to the snows of Norway. One of the boldest tests came in 1942 at Dieppe in Operation Jubilee. Nearly 80% of the troops committed were Canadians, supported by British commandos. The assault was meant to test German coastal defenses, a rehearsal for the eventual invasion of France. The men who stormed the beaches wore their wool battle dress helmets strapped tight and carried Thompsons and Enfields. But the raid went disastrously wrong. Machine guns tore through the landing craft tanks, bogged down on the shingle, and the beaches became killing grounds. The survivors staggered back to England bloodied but unbroken their sacrifice, offering grim lessons that would shape the planning of D-Day 2 years later. It was an era of improvisation and evolution. Soldiers accustomed to the rigid drill of the old army now found themselves learning camouflage, sabotage, and guerrilla tactics. They operated in the dark, raided by night, and struck from unexpected directions. The transformation was as much mental as physical. The British soldier became not only a fighter, but a raider, an infiltrator, a shadow in the night. Yet, through all the change, one constant remained: resilience. Whether huddled on the sands of Dunkirk, charging through desert heat with the SAS, or braving the surf at Dieppe, the British Army endured. The wool battle dress, though plain, came to symbolize the soldier of World War II, sturdy, practical, unpretentious. The Lee Enfield, unchanged in essence from 1914, continued to serve faithfully. And above all, the spirit of the British soldier, stubborn, disciplined, and unyielding, carried the fight from the brink of disaster to the threshold of victory. The red coat was long gone, the kilt mostly ceremonial, but the essence of the Army adaptation, discipline, and courage under fire remained. In World War II, the British soldier once again proved that tradition alone could not win wars, but that the spirit of endurance reshaped for a modern age could still turn the tide. By 1944, the British Army had survived Dunkirk, endured the desert, and returned to Europe with the invasion of Normandy. Yet the war was far from won. Hitler's army still held much of the continent, and in September, the Allies launched a daring plan that they hoped would bring the conflict to a swift end: Operation Market Garden. It would become the largest airborne operation in history and one of the most tragic. For the British, the face of this gamble was the Parachute Regiment, known to their comrades as the Red Devils. Their red beret and winged insignia had already become iconic symbols of courage and audacity. To wear that beret was to join a brotherhood forged in fire. These men were volunteers trained to drop from the skies into the heart of battle. Their weaponry was distinctive. The Sten submachine gun, cheap and crude in appearance, but effective at close range, its simple design allowing mass production for an army that needed firepower quickly. Alongside it, many paratroopers still carried the trusty Lee Enfield for accuracy at distance. But their true distinction lay in their uniforms. The Denison smock, modeled with broad camouflage patterns, marked the first widespread adoption of camo clothing in the British Army. It was a revolution in appearance, no longer the plain khaki wool of earlier wars, but a garment designed to conceal, to blend into woods and hedgerows. Paired with their red berets, it gave the Parés a look unlike any other British soldier, both invisible in the field and unmistakable in identity. When Market Garden began, thousands of British and Allied paratroopers dropped into the Netherlands, tasked with seizing bridges that would allow Allied armor to race into Germany. It was an audacious plan aiming to leap over rivers and bypass defenses. At Arnhem, the British 1st Airborne Division landed with courage and precision, but fate was against them. German forces, including elite SS units, reacted swiftly, and the paratroopers soon found themselves surrounded. The battle that followed was brutal. British paras, outnumbered and outgunned, fought house to house, holding bridges with dwindling ammunition. The Sten guns rattled in close-quarter combat, while Lee Enfields cracked from upper windows and garden walls. Denison smocks, once designed to hide, were soon caked in mud and blood. The men earned their name as Red Devils, not just for their berets, but for their tenacity, fighting against impossible odds with a ferocity that astonished their enemies. But courage could not alter the outcome. After 9 days of desperate fighting, the division was overwhelmed. Of the 10,000 men who landed at Arnhem, barely 2,000 escaped. The rest were killed or captured. Arnhem became a byword for bravery and tragedy, immortalized in the phrase, "a bridge too far." For the British Army, Market Garden was both a wound and a lesson. It revealed the potential of airborne troops, but also the peril of overreach. Yet the legend of the Paras only grew. Even their German foes spoke of them with respect, calling them the toughest opponents they had faced. To this day, the Red Beret remains a symbol not just of airborne service, but of sacrifice. The weapons of these soldiers also carried their own stories. The Sten gun, crude and stamped from sheet metal, was sometimes derided as unsafe or unreliable. But in skilled hands, it was deadly. Cheap to produce, it armed not only British paratroopers, but also resistance fighters across occupied Europe, smuggled into France, Poland, and beyond. Its very simplicity became its strength, a weapon of the people turning every partisan cell into a potential threat to German occupation. Meanwhile, the Denison smock, with its broad brushstrokes of camouflage, became an icon in its own right. It was the first time that camouflage had moved beyond experimental use into standard issue, and it set the stage for the Army's future. For centuries, the red coat had been about visibility. Now, invisibility was the new armor. The smock was practical, functional, and symbolic of modern warfare, where concealment mattered more than pageantry. Market Garden may have failed, but it marked the full transformation of the British Army into a modern fighting force. The days of scarlet lines and even the khaki wool of World War I were behind them. The British soldier of 1944 was now a man of camouflage, of parachutes, of small unit tactics that emphasized stealth and shock. For the men of Arnhem, their courage became legend. Survivors remembered comrades who held out in ruined houses until their last bullet, who refused to surrender even as German tanks rolled forward. Civilians in the Netherlands who watched the battle unfold carried the memory of those red berets with them for decades, honoring the sacrifice of men who had fallen far from home. And when the war ended the following year, the airborne soldier had secured his place in history. Not as a replacement for the line infantry, but as proof that courage and innovation could create new ways of fighting. The Red Beret, the Sten, and the Denison Smock together told a story of adaptation of an army that had learned through bitter wars and hard lessons that survival demanded change. The bridge at Arnhem was lost, but the legend of the men who fought for it was never forgotten. The Second World War had ended in 1945, but peace was an illusion. The Empire's soldiers, weary from 6 years of global conflict, soon found themselves drawn into new battles across unfamiliar landscapes. This time, the Red Beret and Denison Smock of Arnhem gave way to other uniforms, other hardships, and other enemies. The first came in the hills and frozen valleys of Korea. In 1950, the Korean peninsula erupted in war as the North swept south in a storm of fire and steel. Britain, alongside the United States and other United Nations allies, sent troops to defend South Korea. For many young British soldiers, it was a shock to the system. They had grown up in post-war austerity, and now they were thrust into a climate as unforgiving as any in Europe. At first, British troops arriving in Korea were ill-prepared for the brutal winter. Issued uniforms designed more for warmer climates, they found themselves shivering in bitter winds that cut through wool like knives. Eventually, U.S. cold weather gear, thick parkas, insulated boots, heavy mittens was issued worn over British battle dress. Beneath it, men layered sweaters and scarves, anything to fight off frostbite. Even so, many soldiers remembered Korea not only for its battles, but for the biting cold that claimed toes, fingers, and lives. Their weapons remained familiar. The standard rifle was still the Lee Enfield, now in its No. 4 variant, paired with the dependable Bren gun and the Sten for close engagements. For officers, the Webley revolver still lingered, though automatic pistols were beginning to creep into service. To the men in foxholes overlooking icy valleys, the rifles were not just tools, but lifelines reliable even when the cold jammed machinery and froze hands to metal. The battles themselves were brutal. British units fought alongside Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, and Indians in the 27th Commonwealth Brigade, a symbol of empire turned alliance. They faced human wave assaults from Chinese and North Korean forces, often at night with bugles blaring through the darkness. In those moments, training and discipline were all that stood between survival and annihilation. For many veterans, Korea became the forgotten war overshadowed by World War II before and Vietnam after. But for those who served, it was seared into memory, a place where the Empire's soldiers proved once again that they could endure not in scarlet, not in ceremony, but in mud, frost, and fire. When the guns finally fell silent in Korea, another war had already begun, this time in the jungles of Malaya. Unlike Korea, where the front shifted back and forth across mountains and valleys, Malaya was a war of shadows. Communist guerrillas hardened by the Japanese occupation during World War II launched an insurgency against British rule. Their enemy was not an army that could be met in open battle, but a network of fighters hidden in the dense green canopy of the rainforest. For British soldiers, Malaya was a new kind of hell. The heat was suffocating, the humidity endless, and leeches clung to every patch of exposed skin. Uniforms were modified for the climate. Lightweight cotton, often dyed green, or jungle camouflage, with shorts and shirts better suited for the tropics than for Europe's cold. Equipment was stripped down to the essentials: rifles, webbing, and water bottles. To survive in the jungle, a soldier had to be light, quiet, and adaptable. Here the Gurkhas emerged once more as the backbone of Britain's fight. Recruited from the mountains of Nepal, these soldiers had long been renowned for their toughness and loyalty. Small in stature, but fierce in battle, They carried not only rifles, but their traditional kukuri knives, curved blades, as symbolic as they were deadly. In the jungles of Malaya, their experience in mountain and forest warfare made them invaluable. Stories spread of Gurkhas moving silently through the trees, striking swiftly, and vanishing before the enemy could react. To friend and foe alike, they seemed almost supernatural. The Special Air Service, born in the deserts of North Africa, also found new life in Malaya. Disbanded after World War II, the SAS was resurrected to fight the guerrillas. No longer raiding airfields, they now hunted insurgents in the jungle, operating in small patrols, living off the land and striking from the shadows. Their tactics were revolutionary, gathering intelligence from local populations, blending with terrain, and using mobility rather than sheer force. The jungle became both their enemy and their ally. The men who served in Malaya spoke of endless patrols, weeks spent in the rainforest, with nothing but their rifles, rations, and comrades. Rain fell constantly, soaking uniforms, rusting weapons, and rotting boots. Disease was a greater threat than bullets. Malaria, dysentery, and tropical fevers cut down men as surely as ambushes. Yet, out of this misery came innovation. Jungle boots with drainage holes, mosquito nets, lightweight gear, all these became staples of future campaigns. The Malayan Emergency, as it was called, dragged on for 12 years. It was not a glamorous war, not one of great battles or decisive victories. Instead, it was a grinding campaign of patrols, ambushes, and attrition. Slowly, steadily, the British and Commonwealth forces wore down the guerrillas, using intelligence, mobility, and the resilience of men who had adapted to one of the most hostile environments on Earth. For the British Army, Malaya was a proving ground for the modern era. It showed that wars of the future might not be fought in grand clashes of nations, but in small, bitter struggles against insurgents. It proved that khaki was no longer enough. Camouflage, stealth, and unconventional tactics were the new essentials. And it reminded the world that the empire still had teeth, even as its dominion was beginning to fade. The Gurkhas, the SAS, and the Commonwealth brigades left their mark on Malaya. They turned the jungle war into a laboratory of modern counterinsurgency, blending tradition with innovation. The kukuri knife beside the Lee Enfield, the red beret beside the jungle hat, the soldier of empire beside the soldier of independence, all fought together in the dense green shadows. And though Malaya would eventually gain its independence, the campaign was remembered in Britain as a rare success, an insurgency defeated not by overwhelming force but by patience, adaptation, and the quiet valor of men who endured the jungle's embrace. As the sun set on the age of empire, the British Army found itself in a new world, one where global prestige was no longer measured by colonies, but by how swiftly and decisively it could respond to crises. Gone were the days of scarlet tunics and massed musketry. In their place stood soldiers of camouflage and steel, ready to face an enemy that might appear anywhere from a jungle clearing to the heart of London itself. That reality struck home on May 5, 1980, when the eyes of the world turned to Prince's Gate in London. 6 armed men from the Democratic Revolutionary Movement for the Liberation of Arabistan had stormed the Iranian embassy, taking 26 hostages. For 6 tense days, the building stood under siege, cordoned off by police cameras rolling the British public transfixed. Negotiations dragged, tempers frayed, and the possibility of bloodshed loomed. Then, on the 6th day, with gunshots echoing inside, the order was given. It was time to unleash a unit few outside military circles had ever heard of the Special Air Service. As darkness fell, black-clad figures descended the building's rear by ropes, smashing through windows with explosive charges. The roar of flashbangs shook the street. Inside, hostages cowered as bursts of automatic fire rang out. Within minutes, it was over. All but one of the terrorists lay dead. The hostages were freed, and on live television, the SAS announced itself to the world. Their weapon of choice was not British but German, the Heckler & Koch MP5, a compact, reliable submachine gun that became instantly iconic. Sleek and efficient, it was the perfect tool for close-quarters combat in cramped embassy rooms. The black suits, gas masks, and precision of the assault burned themselves into public imagination. Newspapers hailed the SAS as heroes. Other nations sought to copy their methods. From that night onward, the SAS became more than a regiment. It was a legend. But just 2 years later, Britain's soldiers faced a very different test, not in the streets of London, but on the bleak windswept islands of the South Atlantic. On April 2, 1982, Argentine forces invaded the Falkland Islands, seizing control of the small British territory. The news hit Britain like a thunderclap. For many, the Falklands were a distant speck on the map half a world away. But for the government and the public, their capture was intolerable. A task force was assembled, ships, aircraft, and soldiers bound for the southern seas. It was an operation as audacious as any in British history. The men who sailed carried the L1A1 self-loading rifle, a British-built variant of the Belgian FN-FAL. Semi-automatic, rugged, and chambered in 7.62mm, it was a battle rifle designed for long-range engagements. It replaced the bolt-action Enfield rifles of earlier generations, giving every soldier a faster, more powerful weapon. Paired with camouflage uniforms that had by now become standard, the rifle symbolized the modernization of the British infantry. The Falklands War was no colonial policing action. It was a conventional war against a determined enemy fought in some of the harshest terrain on Earth. British soldiers landed on beaches swept by icy winds, trudged across boggy ground under sleet and rain, and scaled jagged hills under cover of darkness. Their equipment was modern, but the conditions felt almost Napoleonic, men marching mile after mile burdened with heavy packs, their breath steaming in the cold. Battles like Goose Green, Mount Tumbledown, and Wireless Ridge entered legend. At Goose Green, outnumbered British paratroopers fought with ferocity, driving the Argentines from entrenched positions in a battle that cost many lives but lifted morale. At Mount Tumbledown, the Scots Guards fought through bitter night combat bagpipes skirling through the smoke as they advanced, a haunting echo of their ancestors at Waterloo. The SAS and SBS Special Boat Service also played crucial roles. Operating in small patrols, they scouted enemy positions, conducted raids, and provided intelligence. In one daring mission, an SAS team destroyed Argentine aircraft on the ground, crippling the enemy's air capability. Their blackened faces, camouflage gear, and relentless energy carried forward the traditions born in North Africa and polished in Malaya. Yet the war was not fought only with rifles and courage. The Argentine Air Force, flying fast jets at low level, inflicted heavy losses on the British fleet. Ships burned and sank. Young sailors and Marines perished in the cold waters. For the soldiers on land, every advance was shadowed by the knowledge that they were fighting at the very edge of the Empire's reach, supplied by fragile lines stretching thousands of miles. After 10 weeks of fighting, Argentina surrendered. British soldiers stood on the windswept islands, their rifles slung, camouflage jackets snapping in the icy wind. It had not been an easy victory. Nearly 1,000 men had died on both sides. But for Britain, it was proof that its army could still project power, still endure hardship, still fight and win against a conventional foe. The Falklands became a symbol of resilience. For the men who had slogged through peat bogs and fought on freezing ridges, the memory was one of exhaustion and pride. For Britain itself, the war restored a sense of military confidence at a time when many had begun to doubt. The uniforms and weapons of this era told their own story. The L1A1 SLR, reliable but heavy, gave soldiers the firepower to dominate in long-range firefights. The camouflage battle dress, by now universal, allowed them to blend with terrain rather than stand out as targets. And the presence of elite units like the SAS showed that Britain's army was no longer just about mass formations, but about precision adaptability and small groups of professionals capable of extraordinary feats. From the heart of London to the edge of the South Atlantic, the British Army had shown that it could fight both terrorists in embassies and soldiers on windswept hills. It could adapt to every environment, every enemy, every challenge. And in doing so, it carried its legacy forward, not in scarlet, not in khaki alone, but in the quiet determination of men who refused to yield. The Falklands proved that Britain's soldiers could still fight and win in bitter conditions. But the wars of the late 20th and early 21st centuries would test them in new ways, not on remote islands alone, but in deserts, mountains, and even the streets of their own cities. When Saddam Hussein's Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990, the world changed overnight. Britain joined the US-led coalition in what became the Gulf War, a lightning campaign across the deserts of the Middle East. For British troops, it was a war of new uniforms, new weapons, and new tactics. Gone was the woodland camouflage of Europe. In its place came desert camouflage, pale browns and sands designed to match the arid landscape. Soldiers now carried the L85A1, part of the new SA-80 family of bullpup rifles. Compact, futuristic in design, and chambered in 5.5mm, it was meant to bring Britain into line with NATO standards. But the Gulf's fine sand exposed the rifle's flaws. Dust clogged its mechanism, stoppages plagued patrols, and soldiers cursed the weapon even as they marched across dunes. Still, the British Army adapted quickly. Maintenance drills were hammered into daily routine, and in the open desert, combined arms tanks, artillery aircraft mattered as much as rifles. The campaign ended swiftly, a coalition victory, but the lessons of the desert would linger for decades. In the years that followed, British soldiers found themselves deployed again and again in Bosnia, Kosovo, Sierra Leone, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Each conflict demanded adaptation. Camouflage changed with the terrain, the desert pattern for Iraq's burning sands, the darker DPM disruptive pattern material for European woods, and eventually the multi-terrain pattern MTP introduced in 2010. Unlike the Americans, whose universal camouflage had faltered, Britain managed to blend colors and shapes that worked from desert scrub to green valleys. For the modern soldier, concealment was no longer just practical, it was survival. The rifle, too, evolved. The L85A1's flaws revealed in the Gulf and Iraq forced a series of upgrades. By the time British troops were deep in Helmand Province, Afghanistan, the L85A2 and later A3 had been refined into reliable, accurate weapons. Shorter than many NATO rifles thanks to its bullpup layout, it allowed soldiers to maneuver in tight urban streets and still fire accurately at range in the mountains. It was a rifle born in controversy but hardened in combat. Afghanistan itself was a crucible. British soldiers patrolled through dusty villages and poppy fields, faced insurgents who struck with ambushes and roadside bombs, and endured long deployments far from home. The modern kit was unrecognizable compared to the red tunics of old body armor. Strapped tight Kevlar helmets, night vision goggles, radios, and camouflage webbing bulging with gear. Yet beneath it all, the same spirit endured, men and women holding the line, adapting to conditions, forging camaraderie in hardship. Technology advanced, but the human experience remained strangely familiar. Soldiers wrote home of heat and dust, of comrades lost to sudden fire of night staring at foreign skies. They joked about their rations, cursed their gear, and leaned on each other just as their forebears had at Waterloo and Crimea and on the Veld. Back home, the image of the British soldier was often not of desert camouflage, but of ceremonial scarlet. At Buckingham Palace and other royal residences, the foot guards stood sentinel in their scarlet tunics and towering bearskin caps. Tourists snapped photos, marveling at their stillness, unaware that these were not actors, but soldiers who could and did deploy abroad when duty called. The scarlet tunic of the guards was more than mere costume. It was continuity. Dating back to Waterloo, when the Grenadier Guards were honored for defeating Napoleon's Imperial Guard, the bearskin cap and red tunic became symbols of pride. Each regiment, Grenadier, Coldstream Scots, Irish, and Welsh Guards, bore its own subtle distinctions, button spacings, plume colors, insignia that marked their unique histories. To see them on parade was to see centuries of tradition stitched into every seam. Modern soldiers clad in camouflage sometimes looked at the guards with bemusement, yet they understood the importance. The scarlet tunic connected Britain's past to its present, reminding the world that while tactics and technology changed, the identity of the soldier remained rooted in heritage. A guardsman who stood immobile at Buckingham Palace one week might be deployed to Afghanistan the next, his SA-80 rifle in hand instead of a ceremonial bayonet. The duality, tradition, and modernity defined the British Army itself. By the 21st century, every recruit passed through the gates of Army Training Center Pyrebright, or equivalent depots, enduring 14 weeks of drill rifle training and the basics of soldiering. It was here that civilians became soldiers, learning not only to fire their weapons, but to march, to obey, and to carry themselves with the pride of their predecessors. Each soldier, whether destined for the infantry, engineers, artillery, or support corps, knew that he or she carried the weight of centuries of history: the red coat, the khaki, the camouflage. In routine duties, the modern uniform was plain khaki, neat and tailored, reflecting professionalism. Yet regimental traditions still colored the details: black buttons for the rifles, green berets for commandos, maroon for the paras. The insignia, the badges, the plumes each carried, meaning a whisper of past battles and honors. Weapons, too, spoke of history's march. The SA-80 family, now refined into the L-85A3, represented decades of trial and error. Paired with grenade launchers, optics, and advanced attachments, it symbolized the soldier's transformation into a modern system of war. Yet on ceremonial duty, soldiers still fixed polished bayonets to rifles, standing as their ancestors had, silent and unyielding. And so the British Army entered the modern age, adaptable, professional, steeped in tradition, yet always changing. From the deserts of Kuwait to the mountains of Afghanistan, from the jungles of Malaya to the cobbled streets outside Buckingham Palace, the image of the soldier was many things: khaki, camouflage, scarlet. But above all, it was endurance. The red coat had once terrified Europe. The khaki had endured the mud of Flanders. The camouflage battle dress had hidden soldiers in Normandy's hedgerows, and the multi-terrain pattern had carried them through Helmand's valleys. Each fabric, each rifle, each tradition was a thread in a single tapestry, the story of a soldier who had changed with the times but never lost his essence. Today, the scarlet tunic of the guards and the camouflage of the riflemen stand side by side. Ceremony and combat, heritage and innovation both are the British soldier. From the Acts of Union in 1707 to the wars of the 21st century, the Army's uniforms and weapons have told a story not just of battles fought, but of identity preserved. And as tourists gaze at the silent guards of London, as veterans polish medals, as recruits shoulder rifles at Pirbright, one truth remains: the British Army is not frozen in time. It is a living tradition, always adapting, always enduring, always bound by the discipline and courage that carried its red coats into the fire more than 3 centuries ago.